Welcome to the 11th Annual Eccles Family Rural West Conference. My name is Kate Gibson, and I'm the Associate Director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. We are an interdisciplinary research center at Stanford University. We're dedicated to the study of the North American West, and we are so thrilled that you all can be here. We're thrilled to be partnering with Fresno State, with the Maddie Institute, and the California Water Initiative, and happy you can make it. I think it's going to be a really great program. So as I said, I'm going to keep this short. We're very happy to have David Mas Masumoto here with us to start things off. Mas is an organic peach and grape farmer and an award-winning author of 12 books, including Epitaph for a Peach, Wisdom of the Last Farmer, and most recently, Secret Harvest, a hidden story of separation and resilience on a family farm, which was nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award. He's won many awards. He's been a finalist in the James Beard Foundation Awards. He's a board member of the Central Valley Community Foundation, Public Policy Institute of California, and more. So Mas will be giving about a 20-minute talk, and then he will be joined by Surabhi Balachander. Surabhi is an assistant professor at Oregon State University in the School of Writing, Literature, and Film. But the most important thing you should know about Surabhi is that before that, she was a longtime staff member at the Bill Lane Center for the American West. So we're very happy that she can't quite get rid of us, and happy to have her here. She grew up in Indiana, and her current book is looking at defining rural identity in American literature from 1920 to 2020, and includes the work of one Mas Masumoto. So I think it will be a really fun conversation. So please join me in welcoming Mas, and a little later on, Surabhi.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, it's like a farmer. You pulled over in the pickup, and we're going to talk close to each other like a pickup talk and everything like that. Kate, thank you so much for this invitation to be here in the Bill Lane Center for this opportunity to share some stories with you. I want to begin with a short little story about our family, but it got me thinking that we're in this age, in this era of a lot of uncertainty. A lot of chaos, I think, is out there. It's as if there's these winds of change that are blowing in all different directions and from all different people. And when you think of the words of winds of change, there's this idea that could link with climate too, where you start thinking about times are foreboding, ominous, threatening, you live with apprehension. There's a proverb that I remember hearing: when the winds of change blow, some build walls, others build windmills. And I think it's very appropriate when you think about climate in that sense, because we're living with a lot of unknowns. And I want to tell you a quick story about my family, and especially my father. He shared this story with me in the 1990s. I had come back to farm, and we were actually doing a prescribed burn of some dead wood, peach trees. And during this smoke, we were sitting there watching it. He told me the story. He told me that in 1942, he had a week for them to be packed up. All Japanese Americans were evacuated and interned. So they had a week to take care of business. The family was renting some raisin land at that time. Raisins are picked in end of August, early September. This evacuation occurred early August. So we weren't sure what's going to happen because they had worked this entire year. He talked with the landlord. And the landlord said, well, I'll give you X amount of money, a very pennies on the dollar for the crop that you raised. Then the landlord was very worried. Who would pick the crop without Japanese Americans here? And there's a little irony there that my family was living on a shack on the house, on the land, and the landlord said, you need to get out. This is 3 or 4 days before they're going to board trains to leave this area. So my dad found another house for them, a good neighbor, a farming neighbor down the street, let them live in the barn for 2 or 3 days before they left. the landlord had found, ironically, what my dad said was an Okie to take care of that crop. And of course, the Oklahoma refugees were climate refugees, right? During the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl. So there was this dynamic of climate that was part of this story. My dad, quiet, very reserved Japanese American farmer, he put the family in this shack, in this barn on a neighbor's land. He went back to the house and he took everything out of the house that was their property because they could only take a suitcase to this relocation center. With that, he piled it up, broke all the dishes, and set fire to it. So he told me the story while we were burning some wood. And the fire, perhaps, that we were doing triggered the story. A few days later, he boarded trains and they went to the Arizona desert where they were imprisoned for years there. But then there's another layer of this story. So my dad and my family are in this relocation camp. And out of this relocation camp, my dad gets drafted into the US Army. And he proudly serves in that. So he was telling me this story. And then we added another layer to it. After the relocation camps, he came back to the Fresno area. And again, what he knew how to do was to make raisins. So he started farming raisins again. This is in 1947, right? Before I was born and before he was married. That year, he had heard of this program that they had for military veterans and crop insurance. So he bought raisin crop insurance in case it rained on the raisins in 1947. It did rain. Most other farmers lost their crop, but because he was a veteran, he was able to get this insurance. And with that insurance, the next year, he bought our farm. So there's this wild story then about how the winds of change that are blowing, and my dad managed to build a windmill off of all that. And it was linked, of course, to the kind of dynamic of climate of life that he had to live through. And in many ways, it was part of how, what I want to talk about today, about how we connect so much about the climate of life with the natural climate at the same time. 30 years ago, I wrote this book called Epitaph for a Peach. And this is a story about a homeless peach. We've been growing it for years on our farm, and suddenly it became orphaned in the marketplace. And it became orphaned because it didn't have this bright red color, and it didn't have a shelf life for 2 years that some modern peaches were beginning to be bred like. I decided that this peach moved me a lot, so we tried to find a home for it, but let me describe the peach. Suncrest is one of the last remaining truly juicy peaches. When you wash that treasure under a stream of cooling water, your fingertips instinctively search for that gushy side of the fruit. Your mouth waters in anticipation. You lean over the sink to make sure you don't drip on yourself. Then you sink your teeth into the flesh and the juice trickles down your cheeks and dangles on your chin. This is a real bite, a primal act, a magical sensory celebration. Summer has arrived. So that's the peach that we grew that became orphaned in the marketplace. And it was part of my journey and my family's journey was to try to find a home for this homeless peach. And we ended up keeping it, and I ended up writing a story about it, and a wild dynamic happened, because here I was, a small farmer just south of here, growing this peach, trying to find a home. I write this book, and suddenly it threw our farm into the world of food. Because I had no idea this whole revolution was occurring. We got nominated for a James Beard Award. Who's James Beard? We were nominated for a Julia Child Cookbook Award. And I said, but there's no recipes in this. But they actually had a category called literary food writing. And we ended up winning that too. And it was just a shock to me. But the idea that here was, I was just a farmer, farming organically, getting thrust into this new world and this new climate that was evolving at the same time. I talk about this because it was 30 years ago I wrote this book. And why is 30 years significant? It's because in many ways, 30 years is how we accumulate average temperature and weather patterns. So Many of us are probably over 30 years old. So when you think of your childhood, it doesn't count. It's not part of the average and normal temperatures that you see. And it got me thinking a whole lot. Okay, how did that happen? And so I did a little research. The National Weather Service was really put together in the 1930s. And when they wanted to use data, they only had data for most places, maybe about 30 years, 1900. So that's how they based this formula of determining what is a normal or what is an average temperature in many ways. So it made me think about writing and farming organically, working with nature and realizing, is climate about things we can measure or not measure? Because if the average normal temperatures are based on a 30-year average and my childhood doesn't count then what is measurable and what would be the way we look at climate in terms of looking at our lives? In many ways, I like to think of our farm as something that I measure in generations. Certainly, my grandparents had immigrated, they were farm workers. My dad bought the farm. I was raised on this. Like a good farm kid, I wanted to get away. So I ran off to Berkeley, thinking that that's a campus my parents would never come visit me at, and they never did. And as if it wasn't far enough, I ran off and studied in Japan for 2 years. And lo and behold, when I'm in Japan, I get to start asking questions about my own background, the climate that my parents grew up in, my grandparents. So I went down to the little village that my grandparents had left from in Kumamoto, Japan, and I end up working on a rice farm. So the very thing I was running away from, I was drawn back to. But in many ways, I think of time in a different timeline there. Because once I got to Japan and was working on this ancient rice farm that had been there for centuries, I began to think our little farm here in Fresno that my dad bought in 1948 that actually wasn't farmed much before then, and I'll get to that later why, what a different timeline. So I began to think of how do we measure time? And I remember hearing stories about farmers in the West never needed a watch. You wake up when the sun goes up, you go out and work. When the sun goes down, that's the end of the day. Time zones in America were only formed in the 1880s. Why? Because the railroads came in. And suddenly they needed to have some way of timing it. And that's why how appropriate with the Bill Lane Center, probably Mr. Stanford had a little role in making sure that we got time zones established so railroads could run on some kind of time sequence. That's when the element of time gets imposed on the rural West. Because why would you need a watch unless you had to fit this kind of structure too much? In many ways, time became imposed on the nature of climate that we have, and that nature was driven by commerce. And I just tucked that away because that's how many ways we're farming now, but yet at the same time, there's other natural ways that we judge time on a farm. And one way I'll describe it very briefly, I'll paraphrase this story. How do we define things on our farm? And one of the things that I was struck when I started farming organically was weeds. And it dawned on me, how do I deal with all the weeds? And I came up with this brilliant solution. I changed what I called a weed. I started calling them natural grasses. It had a nice tone about it. It was much more comfortable. And then I could live with them and start determining what are the true weeds on the farm that I need to take care of versus the natural grasses. So that change of definition, that change of terminology changed my relationship with the farm. A side note, one weed that we have, at least in this Fresno area, is a weed called Johnson grass, which is not a fun weed. It's an invasive species. It was brought to America by Mr. Johnson, who had seen cattle in Africa eating Johnson grass, and he thought this would be great. So he brought it to the South, and it slowly spread across the whole United States. Turns out that the cattle in Africa were eating Johnson grass because there was nothing else to eat. It's a terrible weed. It's a terrible one, but it was brought in by Mr. Johnson in that sense. But it began to make me think of what are the stories that are surrounding the natural things in our life? And how can that story be part of how we engage the future? A recent book I wrote was called Secret Harvest. And this was a book that was about my family. And then, by the way, the books I talk about are available. Marcy, my wife, is over on a table there, and Joan Gibson might help later with Paul too. But this book was helped me reframe climate stories in a different way. Because the fundamental question in this book is, how do we know what we don't know? And I'll repeat that because that was the thing that stuck with me in this book. How do we know what we don't know? And it was a challenge, certainly as farming, I've always struggled with that. And in this book, it's about an aunt that was separated from our family from 70 years. During the Great Depression, she had gotten meningitis and she developed a mental disability. And back then, people with that type of intellectual disability were often hidden and separated. They became invisible. When World War II came and they had to intern Japanese Americans, our family didn't know what to do with her. So she became a ward of the state. The state put her into an institution, and we thought she died soon after that. 70 years later, I get a phone call. She's alive in Fresno. And I had to grapple with this whole family secret that was involved with that. And with that made me rethink this old relationship that we have. The idea that my family lived with this secret and then had to cope with it when we found out she's alive. And I had to go introduce myself to this woman who obviously never met me, and she had no idea who I was. I remember the first time I went to the assisted care center, the one resident there was amazing. He said, "Who are you?" And I said, I'm her nephew. And he goes, "Where have you been all these years?" And he was exactly right, because in many ways, her family was the family of caregivers that they had there. In many ways, when you think of something like a disease, a mental illness and stuff, it makes you think about how we have these distances that we create. And certainly my aunt went through that. My family struggled through that dynamic of what do you do with someone that had a mental disability? You made them invisible in that era. Fortunately, now there's some changes that I think are very interesting and wonderful. So one of the questions is, what are the climate secrets that we have? And do we put those secrets away so they become invisible? Why? Because sometimes we can't measure them. Sometimes we don't understand them. Sometimes the timeline is too big and we don't have data. So does that mean they don't count? Are they really a secret that we have to grapple with? And how do we learn to live with these secrets? And as I farm, I began to realize more and more that was the dynamic of how I was going to farm. I was going to try to grapple with what I don't know and accept that. One of the things that probably helped me the best was when I ran off for college. Of course, I didn't expect to farm, so I majored in sociology, because that would never bring me back to the farm. It turns out it was probably the best thing for me in the fact that because it allowed me to ask questions and accept what I don't know. Where the scientists in the room probably go, "Oh, no, you need to think more scientifically." And they're right. But I just wasn't that way. I was much more right brain than left brain. So I came back farming that way, more with my right brain in that sense, and grappling and accepting the things that weren't quite normal. And one of the dynamics of this story about my aunt was this whole idea of caregivers. Caregivers in many ways were the ones that saved her. And I'll read a short passage about that about my aunt who had this disability in an amazing way. It was the caregivers that took care of her for 70 years. Shizuko, my aunt, knows them well. They take care of her. They respond to her daily antics of she likes to pinch people and trip people. They do not prevent her from wandering down the hallways, but they love her and she accepts their love. They work behind the scenes. They are underpaid, undervalued, and they give care. They receive little respect. They're often like Shizuko, children of immigrants, people of color from low-income households, acts of kindness, pay it forward. compassion in daily life. With caring comes courage. The Buddha once said, after enlightenment, the laundry. In many ways, that's the heart of caregivers. And I thought about that as I was preparing my comments for today. The idea that are we caregivers of the climate, not caretakers? Caretakers implies that we could control it and we could take care of things. Caregivers is that you just give. You know what you're going to get back. So are you all in this room a type of caregiver of climate? And what does that mean? It's really looking at climate, I think, through a different lens. And clearly, one way of looking at that is the lens of water. And there'll certainly be a panel discussion about water. So I brought for you, and you can look up later, a water table from 1991 in this Fresno area. And what struck me about this, in 1996, and I love maps. This is my data, all right? And what I love maps is I looked at this map, and it says where we farm in the Delray area, the water table in 1996 was 30 feet. And that's stunning to think in that short amount of time, it's dropped down now to at least 70 or 80 feet, which is not bad. But if you look on the west side of the valley, then here in this map, it was maybe about 130 feet. It's probably 300 to 400 feet now, right? Which made me start thinking of things that are invisible, things that we don't see. And does that mean they don't exist? I read some articles, and certainly there's some probably geologists in here that are much better at this, of thinking, what are aquifers? And how do aquifers work? One of the dynamics is, of course, that we can't see aquifers. We could try to map them. And there's a basic definition that people think of. Aquifers are like sponges, and they bring the water in. And my conclusion is that's not true, because the ground underneath us is not uniform. That's why I live on a farm that has at water table at one point was 30 feet, and other places are much deeper. There's something else happening with the invisible. And is that not like my aunt in many ways? She was invisible, but that doesn't mean she didn't exist. I also brought in, just for fun, some people will recognize these things. This is what they used to call a relief map. And some of us will grew up with these kind of maps. A younger generation has no idea of this kind of a map because they see things on a computer screen and everything is 2 dimensions. But a relief map is you could actually feel the Sierras. You could actually see that. And that sense of touch when you've worked with climate, I think is so important because this climate is not abstract. It's real. It's something that touches you in many ways. So I brought this in for people to really look at that and get a sense of this towering Sierras that are to the east of us and how the valley is really like a bowl in many ways. It was an ancient lake bed. And you can start seeing that and how we've lost touch with our sense of touch because we rarely see relief maps anymore, right? And I have this, and I have this hung in our kitchen for years because I love that dynamic of being able to feel climate, which is important to me both as a writer and a farmer. And I think people who explore what's the meaning of climate in many ways. One other element, Marcy, one other element is there's another part of climate that we don't think of because we think of climate as weather and natural patterns. How many of you know what hardpan is like? All right. Marcy is going to bring around a sample, and I want you to feel it. Marcy, give me a sample, Marcy. And I want you and pass it around. This is hardpan. It's not a pretty rock. It's not even a rock, for gosh sakes, right? It's like mineralized clay. This defines our valley. Remember I told you that my dad came back and we got this farm because after this rain, and he got this, as a veteran, he'd gotten this crop insurance program. He got our farm because of this goddamn rock. Why? Because our farm was full of this rocks and it wasn't farmed. It was empty and it was inexpensive. It was cheap. So rocks in this sense define us. This defines our farm. So the irony is, of course, how did this rock form? I hope there's some geologists here that could help me later. From what I understand, there had to be some climatic conditions that formed hardpan on our farm. Or maybe a mile away, it's wonderful sandy loam. This rock and the climate that affected it changed the course of our family. This is how climate that happened not in 30 years ago when we measured weather, not 300 years ago, it was probably 3,000 years ago. This defined our farm, and that's why I'm here today, because of this. So when you touch this, feel it. And if you really want, you can even take it home, okay? You need to have a piece of hardpan and know what it's like. I mean, gosh, we have like a million of these little rocks on our farm, all right? But this defines a lot of farms in the area in many ways with that. And that in a way makes you connect with the idea of how do you value something. And in that case, because we had hardpan, our farm was actually valued low, so an immigrant family who was just in prison could buy this land. And it makes you wonder about what are the metrics of where we measure things. And I'll give you a really quick example of that. There are some people who know how water flows in the valley. They're called realtors. And I know it because I get these postcards. Are you ready to sell your farm? And I asked one of them, why am I getting it? And they said, oh, have you ever heard of a 1031? And do you know what a 1031 is? 1031 is if you sell property, you could delay paying capital gains if you buy other properties. So climate change, how does it affect us? Because our farm has some good water, we are prime targets for realtors and 1031 plans. So who would ever thought someone selling a house in San Francisco or LA for $3 million would love to buy our farm and become farmers? No, they want to delay capital gains. Is that a metric? And is that the formula of how we value farms and value climate in that sense? Let me end with this quick passage about the latest book I've done called Shadow Music. And this was a very, very different experience for us. And it talks about, I was approached by the Fresno Philharmonic to write an essay about Japanese Americans. So I wrote this essay about 4 generations of Japanese American farm women. 2 composers composed a 20-minute musical composition, and it was performed last week by the Fresno Symphony. There's a recording of it that will soon be released at the Fresno Philharmonic website. The amazing thing was, how do you look at sound and history? What are the sounds of history? But it made me also think of what are the sounds of climate. So for me, I'm also a visual person. I worked with an artist. So one of the first generation, my grandmothers, when they both arrived to California, my images, they came in the heat of summer to pick raisins. So that's the first image in the book about summer. What's the sound that goes with it? For an immigrant Japanese American woman, doesn't speak English, working in the fields. It's the sound of sweat. It's the sound of hard labor. So here's a question that I had. If I had more time, we'd do much more of an exchange about this. What's the sound of climate? And think of your childhood. Think of the sounds of your childhood, but what's the sound of climate in your childhood? Is it something in nature, rainfall? Is it wind? Or it's something else? So think about the sounds of climate and to approach climate from a very, very different perspective. In many ways, when I think of the sounds of climate as a child, my childhood, I think of a swamp cooler. For those of you who don't know what a swamp cooler is, it's before you had air conditioning. It was a fan that they'd have water dripping on the sides of it to try to cool it down. And I remember as a kid just standing in front in the heat of summer, trying to get cool, right? And we live in the valley in a very arid area. It's not a lot of humidity. So a swamp cooler was my sound of climate as a child. And that's the kind of way I want to take you to start looking at climate in a very different way. to start thinking of climate through this different lens, the lens of music in many ways on that. And it's that idea of the sounds that we live with, I think, that will coordinate different things and different type of passages to you. And I'll read one little essay or part of an essay I wrote in this, where it talks about the music of history. What's the music of history? A song of generations tending the land to grow food, to feed others hungry for flavor. A melody of an immigrant family hoping to plant roots only to be uprooted and then later return to the only place they knew as home. An emotional and sensory tale of a family and community growing, arriving, adapting, adopting, and accepting. And one of the dynamics of the story was, of course, the last generation, my daughter's generation, was she didn't want to be accepted. She wanted to belong. And that's that history of my family, but a lot of immigrants that come through here in the Valley, that there's a sense of wanting to find a way to belong. And again, let me go back to the beginning. In many ways, it's the winds of change that are blowing right now, but it was blowing for many generations and many families. And do we build walls or do we build windmills that go with it? That's the kind of sound and soundscapes that I think we live in the climate world now. So for a moment, think about that sound of climate that we're going to talk about in the next couple days about that and explore with that. That's my end of my conversation. I'll have a conversation with Sabina. Thank you. Thank you. By the way, I only met Sabina a few minutes ago. So we're going to have this wonderful conversation and explore each other's sense of looking at the story that define us. Sabina?
Awesome. So it was so great to hear from you, and I have a million notes that I was taking, and I might start us. One thing that I'm really struck by is that so much of your talk is about time, and I don't know if I mentioned this in our email exchange or not, but the first place that book, Epitaph for a Peach, appears in the book that I'm working on is in a chapter called Rural Time. So lots of resonances. And one of the things that I write about with it is not only the way that you think about, past your family's history, the future of farming, and wondering what the future of farming might be, but also the way that book is organized into seasons. And you've touched on this a little bit as you've been talking, the importance of seasons in defining time in rural places and on a farm. So I wonder if you can talk more about that and talk more about how that fits into the thought about climate.
Well, I think we sometimes get away from thinking about climate and we don't think of seasons, even annual seasons, but how about longer seasons of the golden era of rainfall in the valley, which was probably about 50 years ago. And that's why when you think of a drought that we have, it's probably normal to have droughts, as opposed to it's something that doesn't fit the seasonality of it. What's up? You grew up in Indiana?
Indiana, yeah.
What were the seasons like for you?
Completely different. And I think it's interesting for you to talk about this 30-year time horizon for climate, because I'm close to 30 years old. So this is my lifetime, but I've seen it change a lot too. So I think it's two very different environments. It's much more humid. The crops are really different. It's corn and soybeans. And I had a father who worked on the more technological sides of agriculture too. So what farming looked like to me, what seasons looked like to me were really different than what they would look like in the Central Valley.
How did your father cope with changes? Because technology has truly impacted. I mean, I wrote an essay about the introduction of tractors, and the story goes that the tractors were really formed by Henry Ford, and he said the quote that he's infamous for is, "Ask a farmer if they want a tractor, and they say no." This is in the early 1900s. A farmer would say, "I want a faster horse." But it kind of framed that. And really, in America, if you look at a timeline, tractors replaced horses in the 1950s. My dad grew up with mules on our farm. And our farm, you could see where there are horse stalls. How did your dad deal with the transition? And
I mean, he's kind of behind them, right? Because he worked in a more technological part of agriculture. So he's probably going to watch this later. But he spent a lot of time thinking about how seeds could adapt to different climates. So like one of his signature things was a seed coating that made it possible to plant corn and soybeans earlier and have them survive a first frost. So it's a lot of ways for me, agriculture was always highly technological. happened in labs, and tractors, have more and more computers. There's a lot more and more technology with farming. So I think a lot about rural America is, rhetorically figured often really as being in the past, but on the cutting edge of the future, both as a place where a lot of technological innovations happen, but also as a place that's on the front lines of climate. So there's a lot of ways that rural America can be really future oriented, but then also be defined by this kind of cyclical kind of time that you write about and that you talk about. So I'm thinking about these tensions quite a bit.
You work with a lot of literature, right?
Yep.
And, how does literature grapple with climate and climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are questions that we should ask each other too, but some of these debates too, and one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking is we talk a lot about scale in the field of literary criticism that's come to be known as eco-criticism. Eco-criticism probably makes its first appearance as a term at Rural West here, but we think a lot about scale, like what scale of literary work, what scale of narrative is best for communicating climate? Is it this like gigantic, large-scale novel, the only thing that can communicate climate issues, or can we think at the scale of the individual, of the family, and get into larger issues and larger patterns that way? And I think that your work kind of shows some of the ways that a more personal lens or familial lens can open up these broader ideas about climate. So I would love to hear more too about that, and about, I was struck too when you were talking by how much you used we and us when talking about books that have your name on it. So I would love to hear too more about the kind of collaborative familial writing processes that you have.
Well, one of the dynamics that strikes me is the idea of the power of stories. And I think everyone in this room has a story. Just like when I wrote Secret Harvest, a question I'd often ask is, all of you have a family secret. And people would start nodding their head a little. And then I'd say, think about it and turn to the person next to you and share that secret. And it was stunning. Everybody has family secrets, just like everybody has stories and stories about climate, but we tend not to frame things in terms of stories and climate. We tend to think of technology, we tend to think of data, we think of what's normal, and I tend to be the contrarian, and it's partly because I think, okay, I was the youngest. I wasn't intended to come back to take over the farm, and I was the misfit. That's why I was given the freedom to leave the farm, and my dad was a genius because by giving me the license to leave, he also gave me the opportunity to come back. And I did the same thing with my children too, especially our daughter. Our daughter, went to Berkeley, was a gender and women's studies major. Then she went to UT Austin and got a master's degree in performance as public practice. I think I got that right, Marcy? It was so, and then she came back to the farm. But think about it. The idea of farming and food dealing with climate is about performance. And it suddenly fit that she fits perfectly in the era we're in now with the winds of change that are blowing now. And that's how I come to stories. I come to stories through the idea, through the back door, thinking of it differently and everything too. How did you get into studying about literature? Did your families want you to do something else, like go into medicine or law or something like that?
I don't think they had a huge idea of what I should do, because I was always had my head in a book, always was a mile a minute thinking about whatever I was thinking about. But I've also always been drawn to the way that stories, and also the ways that people describe things, the ways that they write poetry or images, how that gives us a vision of the world. And it's always been a huge way that I see the world. So I'm also, interested in, before we solve the climate crisis, or before we decide how to save something, we have to be able to describe what it is and discover what it is. And I think that resonates with a lot of what you said too about, how do we know what we don't know? We do have to learn to describe it. What we call things does matter, for example. Like
One of the things that
between
struck me,
caregiving and caretaking.
one of the things that struck me was the idea of looking at stories, literature, and the power of imagination. And if you think about it, you think, well, imagination, what does that mean in terms of studying climate, in terms of the topics we're going to talk about in the next couple of days, from economic development to health to water to air quality issues and stuff. The flip side is, if you talk to innovators, it's all about imagination and being able to imagine things 5 years from now, 20 years from now, or in climate, it's really imagining it 50 to 100 or 200 years from now. That requires imagination, and that's where I think stories come in because they give you the freedom to do it.
Yeah.
You know,
And you can do all those things at once and move through history and move through these different scales of thinking about, you can move in literature from the small scale to the large scale in various ways and in new ways. And that's what I find really exciting too.
So you must write too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I write my like boring academic book that's about everyone else's books. And then sometimes I write poems too, but
Just tell me about your poetry.
I haven't talked about that in a while because that's not what I got hired to do. But I do also think about what it means for me to have grown up, not quite in a rural area, but in this rural inflected area, thinking about agriculture, thinking about feeling, out of place in various ways and thinking through the kinds of diverse communities that interact with farming and with rurality and what my place in that might be. So that's a lot of what I write about.
Of good poets who write about climate and climate change?
There's so many great anthologies that are coming out now, actually, if you want hundreds of names.
What would be one that you'd recommend?
There's this really great one called Ghost Fishing, an Eco-Justice anthology. Ghost Fishing.
Ghost fishing.
That one comes off the top of my head. They keep coming, like the current US Poet Laureate, Ada Limon, edited something called You Are Here that's also very concerned with climate. That came out last year. Could keep going, could make a follow-up about this.
It's funny. I have a what do you call it? A love-hate relationship with poetry and climate. Because some I love it, but some are so esoterical. And I said, you've never picked up a shovel, have you? Or you don't know what the hell hard pen feels like. And that's where some of the poets just drive me nuts.
And then there's great people who do both.
What was that?
There's great people who do both too.
Yeah.
So it's really fantastic. Yeah.
And I think they're the ones that get, at least for me, that they get the cadence, the rhythm, the sound that I think I'm trying to figure out in terms of looking at, organic farming and things of looking at climate, thinking of real basic things like, what does it mean when we have this year, for example, our peach blossoms are very staggered, and I've never seen it this way before. What does that mean? I don't know, other than it probably means more work, which I'm not thrilled about. But anyway, our bloom is very, very out of sync, which is not normal, but maybe this is normal for me this year.
And I wonder, I think we're close to time, but I'm wondering if you can close us out too by talking a little bit more about how writing and farming are intertwined for you. And I'm also struck by how that book that's now 30 years old is called Epitaph for a Peach, which kind of suggests that it's, on a gravestone, something already dead, and yet your farm is thriving, you're continuing this into the future. So how has writing helped with that?
I entitled the Epitaph for a Peach because I thought it was the end of the peach. I thought this was the end of it. And I wrote it in the middle of summer when we had 2,000 25-pound boxes of Suncrest peaches with no buyers. And this is a peach that had fantastic flavor, but it didn't have the color that people wanted. So we ended up selling the boxes, and this is back in '95, for 50 cents for 25 pounds of peaches. The broker told me, you should dump the fruit out and reuse the box. And I said, no, we're gonna get it out there because this fruit deserves and needs to find a home. And I ended up writing an essay, Epitaph for a Peach. When it was published in the LA Times, they syndicated it, and I got 20 letters from people across the United States saying, please keep this peach. So armed with this 20 letters, Marcy was helped. She was working off the farm at that time. She came home from work, and I said, look, I have 20 letters. We're gonna keep this peach. And she said, I guess I better keep my city job on that. Of course, one letter I got was a woman from Las Vegas, of all places, saying, oh, I love your essay, and I have one question. Where can I get your peaches 25 pounds for 50 cents? Oh, but it made me think of the idea of the stories that we live, the stories that I do have a home. And that's why all of you in this room are writing climate stories for an audience out there that is much broader than you think. Right now, we live in an era where it's the power of bad that drives most of our stories. And you just read anything, go online, look at anything. Right now, we're being driven by this chaos, this winds of change. But truly, the windmills that you're building are not going to make the news. They're almost private and personal stories like a poet would write, that it involves emotional qualities. And to me, that's the power of stories that we all in this room have. And I want to hear those stories. Please.
All right. And then on that note, our timekeeper has shown me time. So thank you so much for having this conversation.
Thank you.
Give her
Thank
for being
you.
here.